Everyone knows that the US government's foreign policy is deeply hypocritical and based on double standards. However, when you look at what the United States does in Latin America, the level of dishonesty and deception is truly breathtaking. Today, I'm going to be showing how the Donald Trump administration is supporting one of the most corrupt politicians on earth, a Colombian oligarch who is very closely linked to drug cartels and paramilitary groups. This has been admitted by US intelligence agencies. It's not controversial to say that. And yet the Trump administration is staunchly defending him, while at the same time, the US government is starting another coup attempt in Venezuela, trying to overthrow Venezuela's left-wing president, Nicolás Maduro, based on accusations without any proof that Maduro is supposedly linked to drug cartels, while again, the US government is actively defending someone that the US government knows works directly with drug cartels in Venezuela's neighbor, Colombia. But of course, the difference is that Maduro is a left-wing leader who is closely allied with China and Russia, and he opposes US imperialism and meddling in Latin America, whereas in neighboring Colombia, the US government is supporting a corrupt right-wing multimillionaire oligarch who is a longtime US ally, despite the fact that he's been working with drug cartels for decades. So who is this exactly? Today I'll be talking about Álvaro Uribe, who is the former president of Colombia, and he's a staunch right-wing US ally, and he's especially close to Donald Trump and the Republican Party. And this July, Colombia saw a political earthquake after a court found Uribe guilty of bribery, one of his many crimes. This case against Uribe, who is the most powerful politician in the entire country, has been called Colombia's trial of the century. In response to this decision made by a Colombian court, the US government is directly meddling in Colombia's internal affairs and trying to save one of its longtime allies, Uribe, again, who's very closely linked to drug cartels and paramilitary groups. Marco Rubio, who's the most powerful person in the US government after Donald Trump. Rubio is simultaneously serving as Secretary of State and National Security Advisor. And in response to this ruling by a Colombian court, Rubio took to Twitter and he condemned Colombia's justice system. And he said, quote, "Former Colombian President Uribe's only crime has been to tirelessly fight and defend his homeland. The weaponization of Colombia's judicial branch by radical judges has now set a worrisome precedent," end quote. Now, first of all, why is the US government getting involved in a domestic case? This doesn't involve anyone from the US. Imagine if Colombia's foreign minister took to Twitter and condemned the radical judges in the US judicial system and the weaponization of the US judicial system. This is blatant meddling. But the hypocrisy is even more stunning when you realize that the US government has known for decades that Álvaro Uribe works closely with the most notorious drug cartels on earth. This was admitted way back in 1991 by one of the leading US intelligence agencies, the Defense Intelligence Agency, the DIA. It admitted that Uribe, quote, worked for the Medellin cartel, end quote, and was a, quote, close personal friend of Pablo Escobar, end quote. Now, Pablo Escobar is the most famous drug dealer in the history of the world. Netflix even made a famous TV show about him called Narcos, which was very popular in the US. And inside Colombia, one of Pablo Escobar's close political allies was this right-wing former president, Álvaro Uribe, who also happens to be one of the closest US allies. Although I should also point out that this notorious drug dealer's son, Juan Pablo Escobar, wrote a book in which he detailed how his father had worked for the CIA. This is a well-established fact. The most famous drug dealer in history worked closely with the CIA and US spy agencies.
What's the cadet motto at West Point? You will not lie, cheat, or steal, or tolerate those who do. I was the CIA director. We lied, we cheated, we stole. It was like we had entire training courses.
But honestly, that's just scratching the surface of the evidence linking this close U.S. ally to drug cartels and paramilitary groups. The Associated Press, the most mainstream of all mainstream media outlets, reported in 2018, citing declassified U.S. State Department cables, that Álvaro Uribe, Colombia's most powerful politician, was closely tied to Colombian drug cartels. This article noted that back in the 1990s, the U.S. Embassy was informed of the fact that Uribe is a cousin of the notorious Colombian crime family, the Ochoas, and that they were using drug money in order to fund his political campaigns. He was the governor of his state, then he was senator, and then he became president of the country. I mean, there are mountains of evidence linking Uribe to drug cartels. Another example came in 2013 when a close family member of Uribe pled guilty to drug trafficking. The former girlfriend of Uribe's brother Jaime, who is the mother of two of Uribe's nieces, her name is Dolly Cifuentes Villa, she pled guilty in the United States, and her criminal organization was accused of trafficking 30 tons of cocaine into the U.S. on behalf of Mexico's notorious Sinaloa cartel, and overseeing money laundering operations with the cartel leader El Chapo Guzman, probably the second most famous drug dealer on earth after Pablo Escobar. But that's not all. The corruption and crimes go even deeper, because in addition to being closely linked to drug cartels, Álvaro Uribe has also been very closely linked to paramilitary groups, or that's a euphemism, really death squads. This has also been known since the 1990s. The Associated Press, the most mainstream US media outlet, reported in 2011 that a jailed Colombian paramilitary chief accused Uribe of sponsoring his illegal armed group. In a video testimony, he said that he organized a militia that operated from the ranch that was owned by Uribe's family in the northwestern Colombian state of Antioquia back in 1996 when Uribe was governor of that Colombian state. And then he became senator, and then he became president. That is by no means the only evidence showing that. In 2018, the National Security Archive, based at George Washington University in the US, interviewed multiple people who worked at the ranch owned by the Uribe family, and they said the exact same thing. They reported that a ranch owned by Uribe and other members of his family was the operational base of a deadly paramilitary group, according to 3 former employees who said the Uribe family, and especially the former president's brother, Santiago Uribe, had a close and friendly relationship with the leader of Doce Apóstoles, which is Spanish for the 12 apostles, which was a death squad. I mean, again, paramilitary group is a euphemism. This was a straight-up death squad that assassinated people that right-wing oligarchs in Colombia didn't like. Activists, left-wing politicians, indigenous land defenders, anyone who got in the way of their business interests, of big agricultural corporations, of the drug cartels, they would just execute these people on behalf of the right-wing oligarchs who dominate Colombian politics, in close alliance with the US government, by the way. Now, even the New York Times reported on this case back in 2018. It referred to the Uribe family ranch as a death ranch, and it noted that many people in Colombia feared there would be no prosecution because everyone knew that Uribe was extremely corrupt, but he was so powerful that there were never any consequences. And I really have to emphasize that the crimes committed by Uribe with the support of the US government are truly bone-chilling. In 2023, the Colombian military was forced to formally apologize because now, for the first time ever, Colombia has a left-wing president, Gustavo Petro, and he wanted justice for the victims of the Colombian military and these paramilitary groups backed by right-wing politicians like Uribe. Why do they apologize? What happened? This is known as the false positive scandal in Colombia, falsos positivos. And in this scandal, the Colombian army executed thousands of innocent civilians and then dressed them up in the uniform of left-wing guerrillas from the FARC, which is a revolutionary socialist group that for decades had been fighting against the Colombian government. So in the years that Álvaro Uribe was president, from 2002 until 2008, the Colombian army killed 6,402 civilians and then dressed them up in uniforms, falsely claiming they were left-wing guerrillas in order to boost their kill rate. Under Uribe, the Colombian regime literally massacred thousands of innocent civilians and then blamed the left. This is how brutal and sadistic the right-wing oligarchs are in Colombia. They are straight up criminals and murderers. These are the kind of horrific crimes that were constantly being committed by the Colombian regime when Álvaro Uribe was president from 2002 to 2010. And again, he was a very close ally of the US government. And in particular, he was very close to US President George W. Bush. And the biggest irony of all is that the US government praised Uribe as its loyal ally in the so-called war on drugs. I mean, you can't make this stuff up. One of the most notorious drug cartel-linked corrupt politicians on earth was portrayed by Washington as the poster boy of the war on drugs. Like I said earlier, the hypocrisy is absolutely jaw-dropping. You cannot overstate the extreme hypocrisy. And throughout this time period of the so-called war on drugs, the US government was giving billions of dollars of so-called aid to the Colombian regime. A lot of that was military aid from the US military-industrial complex, so US corporations were profiting, military contractors, and sending weapons and military equipment to the Colombian army, as Colombian soldiers were killing innocent people and then dressing them up as left-wing guerrillas and claiming that they were so-called terrorists. These crimes in the false positive scandal were made possible by the massive military aid from the US government in the so-called Plan Colombia. The US government's fingerprints were all over these horrific crimes. And that's why it's not surprising at all to see that today, the Trump administration is once again strongly defending this known drug cartel-linked, death squad-linked former president, Álvaro Uribe, and meddling in Colombia's internal affairs. Because this is also closely linked to Colombia's internal politics and the fact that in 2026, there's a presidential election coming up in Colombia, and the US government is meddling in Colombian affairs to try to prevent the current left-wing president, Gustavo Petro, from staying in power. Again, this is the first ever left-wing president in the history of the country. In the past, there had been left-wing presidential candidates who were popular, and they were assassinated by drug cartels and criminal groups. So the fact that Petro was able to come to power was truly historic, and immediately after he won the election, the US government has been meddling in Colombia's internal affairs to try to destabilize Petro and prevent him from governing. In fact, this June 2025, journalists exposed a coup attempt against Petro by his corrupt former foreign minister, who was replaced by Petro, and since then he's been waging a political war against the president. His name is Álvaro Leyva, and in leaked recordings obtained by journalists, he admitted that he was trying to get support from the US government, including Marco Rubio, in order to carry out a coup to overthrow the left-wing president Petro. And from the beginning of Petro's term, Marco Rubio has been constantly attacking the left-wing Colombian president, including back when Marco Rubio was just a senator, and especially now that Rubio is US Secretary of State and National Security Advisor. He's been constantly criticizing Petro, especially because Petro has been very outspoken in defense of the Palestinian people, which has really angered the United States. So another reason that Marco Rubio is blatantly interfering in Colombia's internal politics is he's trying to tip the scales in support of the Colombian right wing. Because Uribe is basically the king of the right wing in Colombia, and any right wing politician who wants to be the candidate to be president in the elections has to get the approval from Uribe and his allies. Now, Colombia is probably the most blatant example of the hypocrisy and double standards and corruption and criminality of U.S. foreign policy in Latin America. But there are many, many other examples. I mean, first of all, this is a region where the U.S. has militarily intervened in almost every single country. The U.S. government has backed dozens of military coups against democratically elected left-wing leaders in the region. And many of these right-wing authoritarian regimes that have been backed by the U.S., they've essentially been U.S. puppet regimes, and they have often been very closely linked to drug cartels, and they have used drug trafficking to fund their operations. Another great example of this is the former right-wing dictator who governed Honduras with the support of the U.S. government. His name is Juan Hernández, and he's also known popularly as Ho, based on his initials, J-O-H. And he oversaw one of the largest drug trafficking operations in the entire world, while being staunchly supported by the U.S. government. Juan Hernández was an especially close ally of Donald Trump during his first term as president from 2017 until 2021. In 2019, the Trump administration invited this notorious drug trafficking dictator to participate in a special event that the U.S. held at the United Nations, calling for protecting religious freedom. And of course, the U.S. government used this event to attack China and Iran and Venezuela and Cuba and all of Washington's geopolitical adversaries, while inviting as special guests right-wing drug trafficking dictators. Juan Hernández praised Trump as one of his close friends and allies. Now, the reason that Hernández even came to power in the first place is because the U.S. government backed a coup in Honduras in 2009, overthrowing the country's democratically elected left-wing president, Manuel Zelaya, and the U.S. government at that time was led by a Democrat, by President Barack Obama and Vice President Joe Biden, and also Secretary of State Hillary Clinton. These are the most powerful leaders of the Democratic Party, and they strongly supported this coup against an elected left-wing leader and helped put in power right-wing corrupt drug dealers to run Honduras for over a decade. So I should be clear, it wasn't just Trump who supported this notorious drug trafficking dictator in Honduras. It was also Biden and Obama. But the fact that the U.S. government was so openly, publicly supporting a man that everyone knew was a dictator and was a drug trafficker, it obviously hurt the image, the public relations, the propaganda of the U.S. empire. So when Biden came in as president, slowly he moved away from Juan Hernández and he tried to rebrand U.S. foreign policy. You know, Democrats always use rhetoric about democracy and human rights, unlike Trump and the Republicans and George Bush, who are much more concerned with the blunt fist of imperialism. They don't care about all that propaganda. It's cynical propaganda. I mean, the Democrats don't really care about it either, but the Democrats tried to maintain an image, at least, of caring about the rule of law and democracy and human rights. So the Biden administration turned against Juan Hernández after he left office, and they tried to make an example of him. I mean, there are many examples throughout history of Washington supporting a brutal, corrupt dictator and then turning against him when he no longer serves U.S. interests. Another good example of this is Saddam Hussein in Iraq. In the 1980s, when Saddam Hussein invaded Iran and tried to overthrow the new revolutionary government in Iran after the Iranian Revolution in 1979, the CIA gave Iraq intelligence in order to facilitate Saddam Hussein using chemical weapons and gas against Iranian soldiers in the Iran-Iraq War. So the US government had been directly supporting Saddam Hussein, and then just 2 decades later, in 2003, the US invaded Iraq and overthrew Saddam Hussein's government. So similarly, in the Biden administration, they were trying to rebrand imperialist US foreign policy, so they prosecuted Juan Hernández, this former U.S. ally who governed Honduras as a dictator with staunch U.S. support. So I'm going to read here from the decision by the U.S. Justice Department announcing the charges against this longtime U.S.-backed former dictator. Quote, According to court documents, from at least in or about 2004 up to and including in or about 2022, that is when he left office as president, I'm continuing, quote, Hernández, the former two-term president of Honduras and former president of the Honduran National Congress, was at the center of one of the largest and most violent drug trafficking conspiracies in the world. During his political career, Hernández abused his powerful positions and authority in Honduras to facilitate the importation of over 400 tons of cocaine into the U.S. Hernández's co-conspirators were armed with machine guns and destructive devices, including AK-47s, AR-15s, and grenade launchers, which they used to protect their massive cocaine loads as they transited across Honduras on their way to the United States. To protect the money they made from the eventual sale of cocaine and guard their drug trafficking territory from rivals. Hernández received millions of dollars of drug money from some of the largest and most violent drug trafficking organizations in Honduras, Mexico, and elsewhere, and used those bribes to fuel his rise in Honduran politics. In turn, as Hernández rose to power in Honduras, he provided increased support and protection for his co-conspirators, allowing them to move mountains of cocaine, commit acts of violence and murder, and help turn Honduras into one of the most dangerous countries in the world. During his time in office, Hernández publicly promoted legislation and the efforts he purported to undertake in support of anti-narcotic operations in Honduras. At the same time, he protected and enriched the drug traffickers in his inner circle and those who provided him with cocaine-fueled bribes that allowed him to obtain and stay in power in Honduras. For example, Hernández selectively upheld extraditions by supporting and taking credit for extraditions to the United States of certain drug traffickers who threatened his grip on power, while at the same time promising drug traffickers who bribed him and followed his instructions that they would remain safe in Honduras. End quote. This criminal, who oversaw one of the largest drug trafficking operations in history, was also a close U.S. ally, who was strongly supported by the U.S. government under Obama and Trump, and then even the Biden administration, until they eventually turned against their former ally after he left power. This is the perfect symbol of U.S. foreign policy in Latin America. Over decades, the U.S. government has supported dozens of corrupt right-wing dictators who have trafficked drugs and supported death squads in order to support a small handful of corrupt right-wing oligarchs who exploit the country on behalf of U.S. corporations. The U.S. did exactly the same thing in the 1980s after the leftist Sandinista front overthrew the longtime corrupt U.S.-backed right-wing dictator Somoza, and the U.S. government tried to destroy the Sandinista revolution. So in the 1980s, the CIA supported notorious far-right death squads known as the Contras, which stands for counter-revolutionaries in Spanish. And the Contras, with CIA support, not only did they assassinate Nicaraguan government officials and burn down schools and hospitals, they also trafficked drugs. And this was exposed by the U.S. journalist Gary Webb in multiple articles that he published, and then famously in his book, Dark Alliance, the CIA, the Contras, and the crack cocaine explosion. And Gary Webb's career was destroyed for exposing how the U.S. government supported these drug dealers to fund its terror war against the Sandinistas in Nicaragua. And then eventually, Gary Webb died in very strange circumstances, and there's still a lot of questions about what exactly happened to him. So now that I provided all of that historical context showing how for decades the U.S. government has backed many different corrupt right-wing dictators and drug dealers in Latin America, it should be clear how insanely hypocritical it is for the Trump administration to now absurdly accuse Venezuela's leftist president, Nicolás Maduro, of supposedly being a drug lord. And now the Trump administration is launching another coup attempt in Venezuela. So in a follow-up video, I'm going to explain how the U.S. government is threatening military intervention in Venezuela, how the Trump administration has deployed numerous warships and more than 4,000 U.S. troops near Venezuela, threatening the country using the excuse of so-called drug trafficking, which, as I've shown today, is completely absurd. But this is the excuse that the Trump administration is trying to use to justify U.S. intervention to overthrow Venezuela's independent leftist government. And in the follow-up video, I'll explain the other reasons why the U.S. is so obsessed with trying to destabilize Venezuela. It's not only to overthrow the revolutionary government, that's part of it, but it's also because Venezuela just so happens to have some of the largest oil reserves in the world. And of course, Venezuela is closely allied with China and Russia. It's also a close friend of Iran and other U.S. geopolitical adversaries. I was going to talk about all of that here, but I'm trying to make my videos shorter. They're constantly too long, nearly an hour, so I'm trying to make an effort to keep them shorter, under half an hour. So I will conclude here, but in a follow-up video, I'm going to talk about the U.S. attacks on Venezuela, which are based on this totally hypocritical claim that supposedly the Trump administration is fighting drug trafficking. I've already made it very clear today with lots and lots of evidence that the U.S. has a long history of supporting drug traffickers in Latin America. So the attacks on Venezuela have nothing to do with drugs. That's just the excuse. But with that said, I'm going to conclude here. I am Ben Norton. I am the editor-in-chief of Geopolitical Economy Report. I want to thank everyone for joining me today. Please like and subscribe. Please share this. I will see you all next time.